Hello and welcome to On Landscape. Any questions? I'm here with one of our regular hosts, Mark Littlejohn. Hello, Mark.
Hello.
And I'm also here with our guest, Damian Shields, coming all the way from Lanarkshire. Is Lanark a word, or is it officially Lanarkshire?
Lanark's a town. I'm in North Lanarkshire, so North and South Lanarkshire, and the greater whole being Lanarkshire.
Yeah. And for those of us who don't know much about you, how would you introduce yourself these days? What do you have a little mini bio that you tell people?
Not really. I'm just a guy
I'll
with
do
a
it.
camera and an interest in the landscape for many reasons, too convoluted and layered to condense into one line. But I just love the art of photography, and it gives me an enormous sense of well-being. But
I'll do a little one for you, because I did have I read up last time we interviewed you. I was trying to remember when we did a featured photographer on you, but it's you've a background in art from your family from a while back, and you went on to study fine art under Thomas Joshua Cooper. I didn't realize that until I read that today. And went on to work in press and media. I mean, that's a reasonable summary. I'll go back to your family background on art. Is it one of your family was a sculptor? Is that right?
Yeah, my father, well, he was mainly an art teacher all his life, as was my mother's father. My dad studied sculpture at Ontario College of Art. At the time he was living in Canada, my mum's parents had moved over to Canada briefly. My mum met my dad during the height of the swinging 60s. So a few parties later, myself, my older brother Sean and Francine came along. I was only there for a couple of years before they relocated back to Britain, ultimately back to Scotland. So I have really no memory of it whatsoever. But yeah, he studied at Ontario College of Art. So he mainly he majored in sculpture. So that was kind of, my first sort of looking back, what was kind of infecting my mind from a very early age was being surrounded by, a eclectic array of weird and wonderful,
lots of art books,
basically. But I mean, home life was kind of, my dad was, as soon as he kind of, hit the ground back in Scotland, he got a job as a primary school teacher in my first primary school in Airdrie in North Lanarkshire. And he eventually went on to, basically, when my mother's father, Silvio, he was with St Margaret's High School in Airdrie pretty much all his life as an art teacher. And when he took his retirement, he left the position. My father actually slotted in behind him and took over his position. So it was a nice kind of, synchronicity of events, that you could do that and sort of continue the lineage for the family. And so that was kind of, it was a kind of childhood suffused with art and a jazz soundtrack and, just lots of weird and wonderful
covers, the inspiration
sort of things. The house was completely chock full, like a kind of, Moroccan bazaar of like weird kind of objects, and mostly my father's work. He was mainly kind of into abstract impressionism and sculpture. So that was already kind of leaking into my brain from an early age. It's funny, being asked to do this today, and thank you very much, Tim and Mark. I should get that, and thanks for having me on. I'm very honoured, and I very much appreciate it. But it just kind of, it threw me into that kind of head spin of like where you do actually have to sit down and consider. And I'll try not to swear. I had a conversation with Mark about this. So you just try to like self-censor yourself. But
I'll have an 18 rated channel.
If you've got
you've just got to fall back to Billy
that
Connolly.
would be great.
And
but
at the end of the
I was
day,
just thinking,
Billy Connolly's language is, perfectly descriptive. It's just a case of language is what it is.
Yeah. But yeah, just to like actually to sit down and consider who you are, and I think, don't get me wrong, I think it's a great thing to do. I think you have to, and it's like a lot of people on, especially photographers or artists, kind of like only almost like consider their appreciation of their influences and where what they do emerges from is from when they first engage with the tools. But you have to kind of like look at the wider picture of like, every time I press that, shutter release, every time I press the button, it's like the end point in a chain of a thread of events that continue right through my life, right back to the day I was born and the first influences that were seeping into my head. Even though at the time I wouldn't have like stopped and taken stock and realized that was what was going on. But it's only now when like you guys say, hey, Damian, you want to come on this podcast? And I'm like, shit, I have to like kind of, who the hell am I? And you actually have to sit down and, consider.
I wrote a wee bit about that because I remember as a kid, you'd look in the mirror, bathroom mirror, and think, who am I? What am I doing? Why am I in the world and whatever else? And a lot of time,
At our age, Mark, we do that quite a lot.
Well,
we don't even know why we're in the bathroom looking in the mirror in the first place.
I haven't done it. Well, you might be looking at other things when you're wee, but it's like I haven't done that for years. But photography is a very instinctive thing for me, and I guess it's for you. But your instincts have been well honed. I mean, you talked before about Moroccan, so I'm guessing there was a wonderful sense of colour as well growing up in the house, and art was basically something your psyche was infused with, if you like.
Yeah.
Whereas mine, my father was like, totally unartistic. He was a golfer and a whiskey drinker, and that was pretty much all he did. Well, apart from working, in order to get enough money to play
you
golf.
inherited the golf and the whiskey from that, didn't you?
But I mean, the art side of things, I have to say, I'm a wee bit jealous, if you like, because I didn't hit into this until way later in life. But yeah, those, as you said, so you think it's an instinct, but it's really just an instinct that's just grown up with you.
Yeah, because you're not considering it. You're not thinking about it on a day-to-day level. It's like, but when you actually have to kind of like focus and think, well, why do I do the things I do? Why do I have? It's like any habit you pick up over time. It's like you catch yourself sometimes. Where does that come from?
And you think it's a wee bit dangerous thinking too much?
I think so, definitely, because it's not something I do, and I feel uncomfortable doing it. But you guys have kind of forced my hand. And
how was that?
We're not asking you to think.
At the Glasgow School of Art, I mean, that's self-reflection is probably the meat and veg of art school in many ways. How did you cope with that?
Oh God, it was a nightmare. It was difficult because it was almost like expectation versus reality. It was two different things. When I was at high school, there was always an expectation because I had a natural aptitude for drawing and painting and draftsmanship. I was good with charcoal and my pencil and composition on paper and with paint. And I always felt the weight of that on my shoulders, especially given my father's profession and my grandfather as well. And there was lots of other artistic people in the family too. So I kind of felt the weight of my shoulders that the natural progression was for me to apply to art school. And the expectation was, oh, Damien, you should breeze this. He should get in no problem. And I did apply and I didn't get in. And I think I know why. It was because I had a lot of other stuff. I was quite interested in science. I was quite interested in physics and electronics. And I was obsessed with gadgetry and emerging technologies. I mean, looking back at it now, it's like it's a nice marriage for me and a nice balance for having that side of me that's to do with the technical side of things and the technology and the artistic side, just the way things have petered out. But at the time, there was immense pressure. So I ended up, spending years in the wilderness of higher education where I went down to Wales Polytechnic to do a BA in humanities. I went to Bell College in Hamilton to do physics and electronics, electrical engineering. Wow. I did all these courses, but I never finished any of them. I kind of it was like I had to get something out my system because it was a huge interest of mine. And I just felt like it wasn't a kind of FU to my mum and dad, but part of it was a kind of rebellion against the expectation that was for me and that's what I should do. And I kept feeling like, no, hold on a minute. I'm not just, you're not going to pigeonhole me because of, I do have this, aptitude for doing this thing, and that's natural progression. I'm interested in other stuff. There's more kind of things about me that I want to explore. So as I said, I got all that out of my system. And also at the time staying in various places and bed sits and student accommodations and just getting older and having more experiences. And but I did end up coming full circle back round again. But I thought this time I want to get it right. And that's where my love affair for photography began, was in the early days of trying to prepare for art school. I went to what was called the Strathclyde Arts Centre near the Kingston Bridge in Glasgow. The building's still kicking about, lovely old building. I don't know what's been repurposed for now, but it hasn't been an art centre for a long time. But they did a portfolio preparation course, and part of the key ingredient of that was photography. And they had dark rooms there, and we did simple, dark room processing, printing your own film that you were shooting. You used to do simple exercises where you would pair off with somebody, and they had this great big hall that had the really tall glass windows with big heavy black curtains, and they've maybe just opened them a little bit, so they've just had a kind of single shaft of light kind of coming in side light, and you'd stand your pal over there and you'd be shooting in black and white, and you'd go away into the dark and you'd process and you see these images emerge. And I was like, fucking hell, this is amazing. And because it was kind of speaking to somewhere in my brain that was like, my frustration with drawing and painting was that there was a certain amount of this kind of laborious process of sitting down and dealing with these kind of visceral, kind of physical things like oil paints, and mixing your liquid to mix with the oil paint, and having a selection of brushes, and constantly kind of adjusting and wiping off your canvas and starting again and doing pre-sketches and kind of. But don't get me wrong, it's like I really loved it, and I will go back to it at some point. But it was just the immediacy of like being able to see something before you and to capture that moment. And it spoke again as well as one of my biggest heroes of influence was Caravaggio, and I was thinking about the chiaroscuro of like his ensembles of people sitting around a table eating and drinking, and it was just a single point of light coming from the side, and that triggered in my brain, and I was thinking, this is great, just the immediacy of it. And and just anyway, I decided in the end, when I did, after that, this was like a year course, and then you applied and you went for your interview, and you took along your big fat portfolio chock full of life drawings and various bits and bobs that you'd done at the portfolio preparation course, and your photography. And I sat down with two guys, Pete Bevan, sadly no longer with us. He was like the first year tutor for me at the time, and Vaughan Judge, who was photographer, tutor and lecturer at the art school at the time, attached to the fine art photography department. So these were two guys that sat and interviewed me, and it was like good cop, bad cop. And he went through my stuff. And but in that moment, I decided I wanted to go for fine art photography department. I ditched the notion of going into drawing and painting, much to the chagrin of my father, who wasn't too happy about
photography.
But I was like, no, this is for me. There's something here that's just sparked something in my head, and it just really excited me. So, but getting back to what you were asking about, just the process of art school was interesting. I had this expectation in my head because I'd always heard the kind of over romanticized versions of the stories of my father, and stories. My grandfather went to Glasgow School of Art as well, and I always had this impression of it in my head. And but as I said, it wasn't like that really. It was like the technicians were great, because they gave you sort of practical advice and help, and obviously held your hand through the printing process and showed you, like various techniques like selenium toning and stuff like that, and showed you how to use the Devere color enlargers and stuff like that, which to me was like black magic. It was like this weird esoteric kind of art, and very frustrating process, I might add. I ended up hating it in the end. I ended up becoming sick of the darkroom, because that initial sense of having the immediacy of photography kind of waned a bit, and not to mention the fact that it was an expensive thing to do, between your lab fees and your papers and your films and your trial and error, and the amount of paper I was throwing in the bin was ridiculous. And I just remember feeling really demoralised by the whole thing. But the technicians were fantastic. And but the tutors themselves, I mean, some were better than others in terms of how they nurtured you and how. But generally, they didn't really hold your hand, and I felt conflicted because, on one hand, they were kind of saying to you, you know, you've got to look at them, you've got to look at her, you've got to look at him, you've got to expose yourself. You've got here's a book to read, you know, and here's an exhibition to go and see. Here's, you know, a thing to absorb. But on the other hand, they're trying to push this sense of like who you are and your individuality, and that you shouldn't really be looking at other people. So there was all these kind of contradicting messages they were feeding you along the way, and it was quite a daunting experience. And I also found out that, you know, I like you did wee projects that kind of lasted X amount of time, and the culmination of said project was your class crit. So me and the rest of the department, you know, would kind of stand around with maybe one judge, and we go through this one at a time, and you'd have to have a show and tell of what you were up to and what you were doing. And I kind of felt that way. I was kind of like, if I was like the magician who was like kind of explaining how he did the tricks, it was almost like frowned upon because I could basically talk from start to finish about exactly where my inspiration came from, exactly what I was doing, how I got to, you know, where I was going. Yet you could get somebody who kind of like just mumbled their way through it, didn't really say much, and were as vague as possible, and they got like, you know, round of applause, standing ovation. You know, so it was like all these kind of things going on in my head. And I was like, and I ended up, you know, the end of it, you know, just feeling like, is this for me? You know, it started to kind of, and I was worrying that it was making me, you know, it was infecting my enthusiasm for photography in a sense, which I was never going to stop doing, you know, but I just felt it was kind of tainting it slightly because that expectation, you know, of the way it was going to be. I had this romanticized version view of art school. And then the reality was that, you know, the biggest thing I learned from it was at the end of the day, everything's subjective and it's all down to personal opinion. That's pretty much what I learned. And I didn't have to go to art school to learn that lesson, you know? So I kind of felt it's a bit of a waste of time. But basically, after my third year at art school, Thomas Cooper got me in for a wee chat. He says, Damien, he says, you're in the wrong department, mate. He says, you need to be in graphics photography, not fine art photography.
Okay.
Because he was like I was doing, because at the time I had an obsession with, I was getting into pop art. I'd been reading this book, Decoding Advertising, and I was obsessed with advertising and how they constructed these. And it's funny because it still feeds into me today because I do a lot of graphic art, right? But I found it intensely interesting, the juxtaposition of, you know, a packet of fags to some woman leaning on a bridge looking chic and romantic. And I thought that there's obviously a lot more to this in terms of like deep layers of psychology and how people guide you and the composition of these advertisements as well. I thought there's something extremely important here and something to learn here about what you present and how you present it and how you play with notions of symbolism and visual metaphor.
A bit like cinematography and that sort of interpretation.
Yeah. Anyway, I went down this kind of rabbit hole with pop art as well. And he was kind of I think he was looking at that stuff I was doing at the time. And he was like, Damien, no, I think you're in the wrong department. So, but the upshot was I had basically, you know, pissed the most of my grant money up the Victoria Bar's wall. So I couldn't afford to do it because basically I was going to have to do year 3 over again in the graphics photography department. And I only had finances to last me for my final year, my 4th year. Yeah. So I was like, you know, bugger this. There was a course going on down at the College of Building and Printing now. But it's now just a kind of vacated hulk of a brutalist building now that they can't make up their mind what they're going to do with. But it was great at the time. Brilliant photography department. But I did like a kind of print publishing course. So I was doing book binding, I was doing Photoshop, I was doing Illustrator, I was doing InDesign, I was doing a whole kind of smorgasbord of things that were related to printing, of which photography, but more importantly, Photoshop was part of the process of what I learned there, because I'd already started using Photoshop. And this was another reason why Thomas Cooper thought I was a kind of a wrong fit for the fine art photography department, because he loathed anything to do with new technology. You know,
do you think that was unfair on his part?
I think so, because given the way the art school evolved, I'm not saying it was all down to me, but it kind of felt like it a way, because it was ironic that after I left, they invested heavily in new digital technology, digital cameras, a digital department, and now it's like a huge faculty in itself. And
It's
but
like
I
you
was
look,
kind
you
of
look
like
at
doing it
you,
when it
you
was.
described the advertising, photography, and everything else, and surely that's fine art. The images themselves, okay, it's been used for a different purpose, but it almost seems to me like a wee bit of a snobbish approach from Thomas Cooper in relation to what's fine art and what isn't fine art.
Do you
I
know,
mean,
Mark, I think it was just fear of the unknown. I think that because Thomas's ethos, and don't get me wrong, I think I'm kind of vilifying him slightly here. It was just literally an overlap of a kind of earlier generation and a mentality when it came to photography.
yeah.
And because Thomas was coming from the biblical school of like large format photography, where he was like lugging his camera, his field camera, like 40 days and 40 nights in the wilderness, and like spending the same amount of time in the darkroom trying to perfect, the best print he possibly could, a la Ansel Adams. It was like to see that there was this technology where I could sit in a brightly lit room and I could use a scanner and scan a negative or a print and bring it up on a screen and manipulate it in the same, admittedly using the same darkroom techniques I would be using, maybe like dodging and burning and things like that. But I think he didn't, maybe at the time, he just didn't understand, well, why would you want to do that?
Yeah.
I need to see you bleed, Damian. I need to see you suffer, because it's only out of true
He's got a
suffering that you're going
very
to like
modern
have this,
definition of what he does.
epiphany, and you're going to emerge like a butterfly from a cocoon. We
I
just we
would
didn't
think
see eye to eye.
it's a wee bit like you've got to carry a grand piano up 5 flights of stairs on your back instead of using the lift.
Basically,
It's just a bit of. But I mean, when you look at your country, I mean, you talk about advertising. I always think when I look at your pictures that they're beautiful adverts for Scotland, but it's almost like a Walter Scott romanticized.
Where did the landscape start? The landscape connection. Was that during that time when you
I think
started
it
doing
was.
landscape?
I mean, I kind of my first sort of foray, I guess, was pre-art school days. It was I was working down in the Isle of Wight as a lifeguard on an outdoor swimming pool on the Pontins holiday camp on the Isle of Wight. The deep end of the pool was 5 foot. You can imagine most of the time was spent playing the guitar and getting a suntan.
Right.
But that was an interesting place to explore. And there was like an old disused holiday camp just up the road. And it was all overgrown. It was a bit like the Planet of the Apes or something, like one of these kind of post-apocalyptic kind of landscapes where nature was taking back. And you could still see their old swimming pool with all the murals on the tiles and stuff like that, and all the creepers and the blackberries and everyone were coming in, and the old kind of buildings and the big entertainment hall we used to have. So it was almost like for like where I was working, but it was a kind of post-apocalyptic version of that. But I became really pally with the camp staff photographer, guy called Daryl Burton, and he was from the Isle of Wight, and he would go up to the camp generally on evenings, and he would photograph the guests because they would have shows every night. So he would go around the family tables who were watching the kind of cabaret and the shows, or he would photograph maybe during the day if they were having competitions for the kids and stuff like that. He would take pictures of them, and there was he had a wee kind of booth in the reception where the guests could come and collect photographs or buy photographs of things that they were doing during their stay. And but Daryl absolutely hated what he did. He hated doing the whole camp photography thing, but it was good money. And we used to go out together and get drunk and go over to the other side of the island and go to the clubs and stuff. And we spent a lot of time together, really good pals. And he was, but I seen a whole other side to his photography. He showed me his portfolio, and he showed me these photographs that he took, like from the place I was describing, the disused holiday camp. And I was looking at him, I was thinking, they're not conventional photographs. You're taking pictures here of like maybe a broken window grill with broken glass in it lying at its side, and it's a bit rusted, and there's like sort of briars coming into it. But this was interesting to him, but I didn't quite click at the time. But I was seeing photography presented in a whole different light to what I was used to and what I considered photography for B. But it was just all about he was seeing things that he basically liked, that interested him in terms of textures and shapes and colour, you name it. You know, he would point a camera, if he liked somebody, point a camera to take a picture, and it was just purely for the pleasure of like recording the
not
thing
doing
that
anything
he
commercial
got.
with it.
So at its core, you know, it was just the basics of photography. But it really, you know, it sparked something in my head. And when I left, he sold me, that was my first film camera. It was an old Miranda 35mm camera.
Oh yeah.
And he chucked me it for, I think it was like 40 quid. And I think I've still got it kicking about somewhere, probably up in the attic. But I used to take that when I come up the road, because I used to love taking my bike and just cycling around, because the back of Coatbridge where I live, it's all just kind of farmland between here and the Campsie Fells and the Kilsyth Hills. So I used to go up there on my bike, and I used to take this camera with me, and it would just be pulling up to, like, you'd see a white horse in a field, and you'd be like, oh, it's a lovely horse, and, you know, and it's on its own in a field, and it's a beautiful day. You know, go take a picture of the horse, or I'd go down to the local scrapyard and just
See
take
what
pictures of
attracts your
piles of
attention.
like broken cars, because that'd live with me in my head, of what he was doing. And it was just purely this kind of, let's just react with a camera to things you see and things you like, and just take a picture, and then, you know, put them through boots or whatever it was, you know, to get your negatives printed up and get these photographs back. And which was a wee exciting kind of journey in itself, and the excitement of opening up the packet and then obviously throwing half them away because they were all fobbed and had stickers on them, and you just made an arse of them. But it was fun.
Is that when they had the little stickers on them that told you you'd
Yeah,
done something wrong?
The advisory kind of stickers. Like, maybe you should give up photography stickers.
Like Mark said, though, in terms of your landscape photography, and interpreting it as, what's the use of it? When did you start actually deciding that you wanted to do landscape photography as a form of, not a job, but, you know, as a secondary job, as it were? And did you think about it as like promoting anything, or was it just, again, you just being curious?
No, it was just, I guess it was just an evolution. I think when I started working in the Herald, seriously started working full time, and I was exposed continuously to other people's work, albeit of a photojournalistic bent, and also watching constant feeds of wire pictures from Getty, PPA, coming through the wire day in, day out, and also scanning in other people's stuff, because initially a lot of stuff was still analog. I used to operate a massive drum scanner, and, you know, taping the negs onto this massive drum scanner, which evolved into a kind of little tabletop thing. I can't remember what make it was, but it was really expensive. And so that was my job, you know. And so it was just continuously just kind of working on other people's work and looking at other people's photographs, and then just tying that in.
Pictures, I imagine.
Yeah, it was just tying that in, because through the art school process and just the general love of the landscape, because I already had the love affair with the landscape going right back to when I was a child. Because when we moved back to Scotland, I was scared shitless everywhere we lived, which was a few different houses, and they weren't nice. We stayed in a kind of scheme in Airdrie called Petersburn, and they had established this housing area, and it was basically breeze block kind of homes and flats and masonettes, and it was ironically named the Four Isles. So one was Mull, one was Ling, one was Isla.
Oh, really? Right.
And what was the other one? We were in Iona, and down the back of Mull there was a glen. We just called it the Glen, you know, and that's where we went and played, and we went and hid and we explored, and it was beautiful. There was a river running through it, beautiful old arch bridge over the road that takes you up to Chapel Hall. But that was their escapism, and that's where we would go. And exploration was a thing, because obviously you're talking about pre-internet days, pre-mobile phones, pre-anything. Everything's analog. And we had moved around about 3 or 4 different homes. I'd been in about 3 primary schools by this point, and I was getting, you know, what you would refer to in Scotland as a square go in the playground more often than not, because mum and dad were complete hippies. I had long hair. I was getting accused of being a girl every other day, getting asked what team that I support, if I was a Proddy or a Catholic. And I was wearing like flared dungarees and this kind of flare child. So I was getting a lot of unnecessary attention, put it that way. But because I had my older brother and Sean and Francine, it was like we kind of clubbed together as a wee kind of mini gang for security. But we used to just like pushing the boundaries of exploration. And it was about, exploring your surroundings was kind of like a way of kind of making peace with a place and feeling secure and feeling that this is home, because we desperately wanted something to call home. And because we were frightened, and because it would be reason to be, because we had enough experiences along the way to make us wary of where we were. And it was like people kind of automatically almost rejected us because we were a wee bit different. And I think I was still carrying a Canadian accent and calling the pavement a sidewalk and things like that. And
You're not from around here, are you?
yeah, so it was like this idea of pushing your boundaries and exploring, especially finding somewhere like the Glen down the back of the scheme, was brilliant. And we used to go out and catch newts, and we used to put bumblebees in a jar and things like that and bring them home and watch them buzz around. We'd let them go, you know what I mean? But it was just these fascinating wee engagements with nature, or building a swing on a tree over a river and things like that.
Definitely not wasp factory territory.
But you know what I mean? It was like, so I already had this love of exploration, because it gave me a sense of my fear eroded away a wee bit more each day that I kind of pushed my boundaries and went a wee bit further. So when we eventually moved to Coatbridge, and the home that I kind of largely grew up in, I could see the Kilsyth Hills and the Campsies from my bedroom window. And it was just wondering, I wonder what's over the other side of those hills, you know, and it just kind of like, it was like a I was reading a lot of fantasy books at the time as well, and escapism literature, science fiction and horror and fantasy. And it was just that kind of notion of like, I don't know what's beyond those hills. You know, I want to find out. So every time I'm out with my bike, you know, I try and cycle a bit further, you know, till maybe one day I got all the way up to the Campsie viewpoint and stood there like Rocky Balboa, you know, looking back at the landscape before me. But it was just this notion of the tantalizing nature of a place not visited, and to visit that. And I felt like the wider that reach would spread out, then the more I would feel at home, and I'd feel a sense of place. I'd feel a sense of who I am and attached to a place. And obviously going back again and again and again, but it just involved into taking the camera with me. As I said,
how long did that take until you reached the Highlands then?
Christ, I remember I got up to Rannoch Moor the first few times and just going, holy shit. And, you know, like literally, you know, and by that point I had a digital camera. I was like the early days of digital photography, and like literally just like filling every single compact flash card I had with images. I was literally shooting thousands, because it was like, I'm trying to like take all this in.
Everything's amazing.
Just everything, you know, that I'm seeing is just, and I've kind of, as I've worked out over the years, you know, I'm a wee bit oversensitized to visual information. And I could see that in the early days that I wasn't really coping with that. And I just kind of always had a fear of, you know, that kind of FOMO feeling of like coming home and feeling that I'd not got something, I'd not captured something, not witnessed something and brought it back, because it was almost like, you know, it didn't happen if I didn't bring it back with me, so I could then look at it and spark something in my head for the next visit. And, you know, and I just wanted to cover all bases, and I was too kind of like, whereas I'm kind of the opposite now, and it's like I'm taking hardly any images when I go. I'm trying to.
When did that change then? Or how? Go on, Mark. Sorry.
It's more. So it's really, the photography is almost like secondary, because you're using that to display your love of where you are, your love of what you see in front of you, and these little bits of beauty that make your heart beat faster.
Basically, yeah.
As opposed to, I mean, I always felt that going into photography was secondary to, I suppose I fell in love with the landscape, and then the camera just became a way of me sort of capturing the little bits that I saw in my head.
Yeah.
And that's pretty much for me, and it sounds, you know, it's a similar sort of thing for yourself. It's not a case of Thomas Cooper saying, right, you're doing this, or you go to art school, so, you know, look at this book, look at that book, look at whatever else. Your photography for me just seems to spring from a love of where you are, a love of what you see in these little moments. And I suppose it's then your instincts, as you were saying before, from the way you were brought up, from what you saw when you were getting brought up, the colours, everything else, has resulted in how you take photographs now.
Yeah. How does that affect the way you go out and look for pictures in terms of either reacting or planning, whatever?
I don't know, I guess like I'm a bit like, you know, obviously, Mark, always kind of like, I'm kind of on the sidelines seeing what you're up to as well and what you're talking about. And a lot of it, chime, you're saying how things that I'm saying are chiming with you. A lot of things that I see you saying chime with me as well. And that, especially around the aspect of using a tripod, that's one that comes to mind. Where I've kind of, similar to you, I think you shoot a lot of stuff handheld now, as opposed to, feeling things need to be a bit more considered and set up. You're just being you're being a lot more reactionary now, and just carrying it in your hand and taking stuff as you go. Because I feel that I've kind of evolved a lot more into that side of things, and so I mean, I'm still kind of like, I still will slow down sometimes if I arrive at a location and stop and take it in and take a more considered approach to composition. But I think there's a kind of 50-50 thing, really, because when I'm going from that point of considered composition to the point over there of considered composition, I've always got the camera to hand, usually with the 200mm, where I'm kind of catching stuff as I'm going, sort of thing. And I always think you have to be, I'm not a very technically minded person, but I do think you have to obviously learn the ropes of, how things function in like the holy triangle, and you have to familiarize yourself with your own equipment to the point where it does become instinctual and second nature to be able to react, because you guys know yourself, there's sometimes something happens and it can literally be a nanosecond, and that you are now, compared to where you are now, to compared to the way you were 10 years ago, 10 years, you wouldn't have got that shot. But now you're prepared for it, but it's just hardwired in here now. It's just an instinctual thing. You know what your go-to equipment is and your go-to settings are to make sure you're not robbed of that moment and, the horrible feeling of having missed out. So there's that kind of side of it for me, which I enjoy more, is just being reactionary and getting a wee bit lost. Because like when I was a wee boy, it was about not knowing where that wee path through the bushes led, where you would end up if you followed it. And
Does that mean a lot of your
even though it looked a wee bit dangerous and a wee bit dark and shady, and but it's the same thing. It's like trying to kind of like, although I mean it's different if you're doing it as a job or something like that. I'm really OCD and meticulous about planning if I'm doing it for somebody else and making sure I increase my chances of getting the goods and getting what I think that they would require versus me putting my own stamp in it. I mean, I'm never completely kind of subservient to somebody saying that I'm going to change the way I do things for you, because I would like to think the reason why they're asking me to do the job in the first place is because they like what I do and they want me to do more of the same. But for them, so it's a different approach. But for myself, I mean, I just love opening myself up to, happenstance and randomness.
Does that mean you go for a walk, essentially? Go to explore, go to wander around somewhere to see what it's like?
It's always just a general area kind of thing, and it's obviously keeping an eye on conditions and or just areas that you kind of. But then I always feel you get the best out of the land if you familiarise yourself as much as you can with an area, and it is about going back again and again, and while you're there, saying to yourself, "Do you know what? I didn't get the best out of today, but at least I came, and at least I stood in this spot, and at least I saw that view, and I took a mental note that."
Do you think that sense of love for a particular area comes through in your photography? I mean, you've got an awful lot of nice stuff from, I think it's Loch Chon and Loch Ard, and I always get the feeling that when I look at those, that intimately, like some of the images from Camasineri as well, you get the feeling that it's favourite little bits, little things that you love, and you take a picture of it.
Yeah. Basically, it's just like there's special places that draw me back again and again, and it's almost like an unresolved conversation that you've been having with them that spans many years. And there's some places you kind of you almost like say goodbye to, because the conversation's been resolved and you feel like you've came away with resolution, and you feel like there's no sense in adding to a pile and trying, because I go completely against this kind of idea of perfection anyway. So I'm not trying to achieve a set sense of perfection and completion. It's just that I've got something that I feel that I'm happy with. So sometimes I'll kind of I'll maybe still go back to these places, but I don't feel a draw to them as much to other places. It's like, as I said, it's just kind of like maybe been to a location maybe 6 or 7 times, and I feel it's still unresolved, and I just feel like I just feel like, you know, and obviously these are all kind of beautiful places that you would want to go to anyway, but it's just kind of something's maybe unresolved feeling about it. You feel like if I get that special day, that's but you know, it's not about like the perfect moment, but just for you, for this ongoing conversation you've been having with a place, and you feel there's a bit more resolution.
I've always hated the idea of perfection, because I always think perfection just implies sort of like something that's sterile and lacking in atmosphere and lacking in mood. I'm not saying that, you know, your pictures aren't perfect sort of thing, but you know what I mean? It's just that thing. I think it's just, you know, character, atmosphere, individuality. I mean, almost every image I think we take, there's a compromise somewhere. It's just learning to live
definitely.
whichever
I even
suits you best.
deliberately include things, you know, like, you know, pylons or a bit of litter that people maybe don't spot in first glance and things like that. I just love kind of throwing people off about something that's in there because they haven't looked hard enough or they haven't seen it, or just something about the overall composition that kind of unsettles you. And that's maybe going back to my days of like looking at advertising. I don't know where that comes from, but like you, Mark, I hate the idea of perfection, but I see a lot of people that are kind of like, you know, fervently trying to pursue the sense of perfection, and you can see it comes across in their images because they're all seem to be converging in the same place in terms of the way they look, and it drives me nuts because the thing is, I can't see them in their pictures anywhere. They are nowhere to be seen.
There's a desire to try and simplify things in a lot of landscape photography, and you end up just making things bland because they're oversimplified. There's not much left apart from a small structure. Yeah.
But it's like, I mean, I suppose sometimes when you think about when you go to art school and they're saying, right, look at this book, look at that book, and I sometimes feel with, you know, when you're saying about the perfection, you get the Stepford Wives School of Photography, where it's just, you know, everything's done just so, everything's perfect. There's, you know,
uncanny valley of photography.
Yeah, I mean, people should say, well, there are no rules. There's only you, especially now, given the emergence of artificial intelligence and how it's encroached upon the art world. I think that now more than ever, and I think that's something positive that I feel has come out of the whole discussion, the emergence of AI, is it puts front and center, just like you did to me by asking me on this thing in the first place, was to stop and consider what it means to be a human being and what it means to have individuality and how that affects your creativity. And it kind of puts that in a spotlight almost. It's like, because at the end of the day, what do you want to take home and possess if you go to a gallery or something like that? You know, is it just because it's pretty? You know, is it just purely the pure aesthetic, or are you interested in something that's deeper? Are you interested in, do you care who painted this painting? Do you care who's like made this sculpture?
About people, doesn't it?
You know, and I think it brings these things into question. I think it's quite a pertinent, necessary debate that we should be having. And I think if anything, humanity hopefully, you know, come out the better side of the discussion, because with the proliferation of AI into people's psyche and into society and at every layer and every level, I think it does kind of bring us back to the basic concept. And I think a wee bit of it comes from, for a lot of folk, especially in the creative industries as well, it's a little bit of fear, isn't it? It's a little bit of kind of considering, well, where does that leave me?
Yeah, it's commoditizing creativity.
Yeah, but it's a chance and it's an opportunity for people like us to stand in our soapboxes and shout about, you know, being a human being, having a lifelong of experiences that create a unique object or a photograph or a thing that is the culmination of it, like my 55 years to bring you this thing, you know. That's the evolution of that, not pushing a fucking button.
I like to see a set of pictures that portrays a character or portrays what you're interested in. You know, I look at a set of pictures of yours, I get an idea of who you are. And one photograph on its own might not do that in the same way, but I don't think AI will ever have anything like that, where you're getting a sense of somebody and a character and a level of interest to whether you're interested in woodland or mountains or.
But as it gains more and more experience of more and more people and more individuality, you've got music and everything else. I mean, I just hate the idea of it for music. I love listening to different folk, It's just listening to different albums on the way up the road from Milton Keynes over the last 2 days. It's great discussing music with other folk.
Yeah.
In terms of your artwork, I know your use of contrast is quite powerful, and I see it. And in one of your interviews, you mentioned Vermeer and Chiaroscuro, and also mentioned Samuel Palmer and his work. And I see a little bit of that, and I see a little bit of Thomas Joshua Cooper in the way you play with contrast and the blacks in pictures. Was that a conscious thing from the start, or is it that reveal itself over time with your post-processing? Because you worked as a retoucher as well, didn't you? So did that inform the way you worked?
I guess so. I've always been interested in techniques that kind of almost like play with your brain in terms of depth perception. I mean, Mark, I know you're kind of, this is something you're quite interested about. It's like the use of split toning. Because I was always taught in painting about the use of color tones to create a three-dimensional,
recession and forward.
Yeah, it's like receding, warms and cold hues, and how you can infuse a shadow with a colder hue and highlights of the warmer hue, and that immediately creates a sense of separation. So I'm always conscious of, because although, especially in the early days, you can see a lot of, I mean, I look at some of them now and I can think, well, maybe it was a wee bit too heavy-handed there, but I could see where I was going with it. I try to be a bit more subtle about it now, but the basic sort of premise is there, where I'm trying to kind of like push an image into something that retains a sense of its identity and its place. It's not about ramming a square peg into a round hole and introducing anything that is alien to the place. It's about enhancing what is there. And it's also about bringing it to a place in terms of where it exists for you in your mind after you've gone home and you've left the place. So that's a wee bit of the romanticism that kind of creeps in my mind, where I'm trying to mold things in terms of my approach with tone and contrast to, I want it to kind of speak to me in the way it spoke to me when I was there, in terms of how I've created a memory of a place.
It's like recreating it as you envisage it in your own mind's eye.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's almost like a bit of artistic license with a camera. And that's how I see the process. And I see you doing the same thing. It's a romantic. I mean, I was thinking about Walter Scott and whatever, but it's a romanticized view of Scotland. It's how we see it, how we'd love to see it, how we think of it in our own heads, and then creating that vision on the screen in front of you. And sometimes now, when I come back in and I look at the picture after I finished it and everything else, that's how I remember the scene. I don't remember the scene as it was exactly at that point. I remember it as it is now created in front of me on the screen, because it's, I suppose, the labour of love. It's how it now, or how it presented itself to me in my head. And in fact, it's not 100% real because of what I've used with colour or the darkness or whatever else, and so be it. Couldn't give a bugger. And I see that in yours, and I think that's possibly why I love it, because I see it and I almost identify the Scotland I love with with what comes out in your images. And I love the fact as well that you look at a lot of your images and they're not of any really immediately recognisable bits of Scotland. They're just little snippets of beauty that could be just about anywhere.
Yeah.
Does that inform your choice of weather to go out in as well, in terms of this sense of contrast?
Could you ask that again, Tim?
Yeah, does this inform your choice of sense of the weather you like to go out with in classical Scottish mixed conditions?
Yeah, I guess I've got my favourite conditions, but they do change and they do evolve. And I guess, I mean, it's going to sound terribly cliche thing to say, but I just think that, you know, you can always get something out of any conditions. And I sometimes like to be challenged, especially at this time of year. You kind of think, you know, what the fuck am I going to do? You know, the sun's kind of high in the sky and it's like, it's just blue, green, blue, green, blue, green.
It was for a
And
month.
it, you know,
Yeah.
and it's like, well, what do I do with that? But I find that interesting now where I would have been like hibernated for the entire summer before. Um, but I do like, I'm a sucker for, and I've got a soft spot for, you know, obviously moody skies and, you know, especially like the particular quality of light right after a terrible shitstorm of conditions and when things start to break. I love that. I just love a dappled landscape. I always love a wee dappled landscape. I just love the clouds just gently drifting little pocket pools of light. I could sit and watch them all day, just drifting across the hills. So I don't know if that answers your question, but any weather.
Yeah.
But I guess I do have kind of favourite
Any,
conditions.
any weather as long as it's interesting.
Aye, that's the one. So I was trying to say, Mark. Thank you.
And your interpretation of black and white, I noticed you mentioned in one article about having your camera in black and white mode. Is that all the time, or is it just when you decide to work in?
No, it's just I don't do it so much now, but for a while I did it religiously. It was just purely to like, I thought, you know, what if I'm just considering my composition in terms of
tones. Yeah.
mono, you know, just composition, because as I alluded to before, it's like sometimes I feel like I'm oversensitized to color, light, and texture. It's like it really bombards my mind. And I thought that's maybe a way to kind of calm myself down a wee bit. And just to purely kind of like form something within a digital viewfinder, the back of camera, or to snap and just check it on the back and to look at it and make a consideration based upon what I was seeing, whether I recompose or just go somewhere else. You know, and it was an interesting exercise to undergo. I don't do it just now. I haven't done that in a while, but yeah, but I felt it was a good
Yeah.
thing, a good process to do.
And you work in well, you've done courses in books, printing. Have you done many books of your own, or do you have any plans to do anything in
I've
that
a
medium?
rough plans to do something myself. I just finished a book there for, do you know, the photo view series? Diggy Cunningham had just completed or he's in the middle of doing the Northern Highlands. I've just completed the Western Highlands. I met with the publisher just recently, and you're talking maybe early next year before you'll see that hit the
That's cool.
bookshops.
Yeah.
So that's been an amazing thing to do. It's been maybe dragged on a wee bit longer than I thought or hoped it had done, because when I first sat down with Doogie and Mick Ryan from PhotoView, we're talking like about 5 years ago, and then COVID hit, and as
The
well,
big
so it was in the
project
middle
as
of
well.
all
It's not
that,
like
and it's just been, obviously I work full time as well, and you know it's taken me a long time. Admittedly, I had a lot of locations already in the bag for the book, but I had to go out and visit a lot of new places, which was great in itself. And the writing, obviously, you know, is kind of went on a wee bit longer than I hoped it would. But thankfully, we're there with it. And yes, to answer your question, there's a book on its way in the form of the photo view guide. But I will, at some point, do something a wee bit more personal in the near future.
Would there be a wee bit of writing in there as well? Because I know sometimes when you put your pictures up, there's wee bits of writing. It's obviously thoughts that you had when you were taking the pictures, or would it just be a pure collection of images?
Yeah, in my head, I thought I didn't want to do a book. I definitely want to do a wee bit of writing, but not so much descriptive in terms of, you know, here's a place,
Yeah.
or even here's a place and what this place means to me. It's almost like I'm still unsure about it, how it would be received, you know, that people expecting a book about landscape or my images.
yeah.
And but a lot of it, I guess, is kind of just the kind of stuff that I've been talking to you guys about, which I feel is terribly important. It might even just be a rambling story about the time you fell in the burn.
Yeah,
And
I like those ideas of very personal
but just
stuff.
something that comes out of it, that something speaks to your journey, because there is a connection to the photographs. It's just not immediately apparent and obvious.
Yeah.
And if you're buying a book that's about my work, then I would assume that you're already interested in me and my work. Therefore, I'm just almost like filling in some of the blanks, giving a wee bit more of myself. And I like writing. I always find it a difficult process, but at the same time, I really enjoy it.
Yeah.
And it'd be good to get back to, because I used to dip into a bit of poetry as well, and it'd be good to get back to doing that as well. And I would like to include a wee bit of that in a book as well.
Yeah.
But I'll say
Yeah,
no more, because
that'd be really nice.
it's very embryonic in my brain. I've been taking notes for this book for the past 20 years. So,
Yeah, because you think, it's photography. How many people are going to read anything, or they're just going to flip the page to the next picture?
yeah.
I think books with just photographs in are boring. I've got to say, I like to think of a book as a symphony of not just the pictures, but the chapters, the separation.
Open it up and some music plays as well.
Yeah, that'd be quite good. Like the little
Something
birthday
jumps out the pages at you.
Yeah.
Birthday.
So, as a last question, because we're running up to an hour, what are your favourite parts of the Highlands or Scotland for photography then, or for personal?
Ridiculous question, Tim. Next.
I'm interested. No,
honestly, I can't answer that question. I'm being honest here. There's places I love. There's places I've been back to more than I've been back to other places, because I know that. But it's more of usually a logistical thing. It's because maybe I know a trail that goes somewhere like maybe up to the Falls of Kirkcaldy. If I get tired by the time I get to the falls, at least I know exactly I can head back. But if I'm feeling that my legs are up to it, I can push a bit further up to Sylvan, and so there's always those considerations. And I obviously love Torridon. I love all the Western Highlands, the Northern Highlands. I gravitate more to the west than I do to the east. But again, it's a logistics thing as well. It just depends on where you stay, and what sort of effort and plans you have to make in terms of the road networks and the transport networks to get access, between you having the inclination to go somewhere with your camera and how you're going to get there and when you're going to return, and the pre-planning and everything you need to pack and things like that. So,
do you camp a van or stay in accommodation, or when you're away?
So the rare time I camp, I've got a couple of tents. I'll maybe go and do a wee wild camp, but usually I prefer the comfort of a bed, and I'll just do a B&B, so I can get my meal at the hotel in a dram, maybe a Guinness, and get a good night's kip, and feel refreshed the next day, which I don't get from the tent.
No.
Well, thanks very much. Really enjoyed that.
No, thank you, Tim, for having me. As I said, Mark, cheers for getting me on. I've got a terrible bloody imposter syndrome that I carry with me everywhere I go. As I said, I was like, what the hell am I going to, who am I? Why do I do the things?
I think that's healthy attitude sometimes.
Yeah, it's getting the right balance, isn't it? And it's and I think too much self-introspection isn't great, because then it maybe interferes with what we do, and it interferes with our instincts, interferes with our individuality. As you were saying before, that snapshot you take isn't the result of like half a second's thought. It's about the last 55 years. But if we start questioning different aspects of that 55 years, we'll just disappear up our own fucking arses.
Did I say 55? I meant 35.
Okay. It's been a fucking tough 55. 35. Although you're graying better than I am, this is just vanishing. Yeah.
That's brilliant. Well, thank you very much, Mark and Damian.
That was great to see you.
Yeah, 10 years.
Yeah. Right, I'm going off to find my boy. He went up walking up towards the base of Bashfin, but the weather's closed in, so I said, I'll